On their anniversary, the millionaire announced his secretary was pregnant with his child, then called his wife barren, but he underestimated her power. Today's intro is too short because most of you left the story, and it hurt my hard work. Hi, my beautiful family. This is your brother, Mr. Peter. From my heart I pray, may the heavenly God bless every woman here with honor, love, and peace. May every sister and mother be protected with dignity and joy, and may every child in this family grow in light and blessing. I write these stories only with love for you, my family. Your support keeps me strong. Your love gives life to this channel. Please watch with your whole heart, like and comment, because together we are one family forever. If your heart is true, write, present. If your love is real, write, I am with Mr. Peter. The champagne flute shattered against Italian marble, its crystal fragments catching light like fallen stars. The exact moment Ruth Farrell realized her marriage had been a 20-year performance, and she'd been the only one who didn't know it was staged. The grand ballroom of the Condon estate hummed with the elegant chaos of their 20th wedding anniversary celebration. 300 guests mingled beneath chandeliers that Colin had imported from a French chateau, their light casting golden shadows across faces Ruth had smiled at for 2 decades. Faces that, she would soon discover, had been keeping her husband's secrets far longer than they'd been keeping her company. Ruth stood near the towering windows that overlooked the manicured gardens, her reflection superimposed against the darkness outside, a ghost of herself already haunting this life. At 42, she had maintained the elegance that had first caught Colin's attention at a charity auction all those years ago. Her deep burgundy gown, designed specifically for tonight by Oscar de la Renta's protégé, hugged her figure with architectural precision. Her skin glowed with the careful maintenance of someone who understood that in Colin's world, a wife was as much an asset as a stock portfolio. "You look absolutely radiant, darling," Margaret Condon's voice sliced through Ruth's reverie like a scalpel through silk. Her mother-in-law approached with the predatory grace of someone who had spent 68 years perfecting the art of the subtle attack. Margaret's white hair was styled in a severe chignon that pulled her features into an expression of permanent disapproval, though tonight there was something else in her ice-blue eyes. Anticipation. "Thank you, Margaret," Ruth replied, her voice steady despite the strange energy crackling through the room. She'd noticed it the moment she'd descended the stairs. Hushed conversations that stopped when she passed, glances that slid away from hers like oil on water. 20 years, Margaret continued, her thin lips curving into what might have been a smile on anyone else's face. "Not many marriages last that long these days. Though I suppose when there are no children to complicate things, it's easier to maintain the facade." The word hung between them like a blade. Ruth had grown accustomed to Margaret's references to her childlessness, each one delivered with surgical precision to wound without leaving visible scars. 5 miscarriages in 10 years had taught Ruth that some griefs were too private to share with people who would only weaponize them. "Colin seems anxious tonight," Ruth observed, deflecting as she watched her husband across the room. At 45, Colin Condon still commanded attention with his silver-touched temples and the confident bearing of a man who had turned his father's modest construction company into a real estate empire worth $500 million. Tonight, though, his usual swagger seemed forced, his laughter a beat too loud, his gestures a fraction too animated. "He has something special planned," Margaret said, and Ruth caught the flash of something cruel in her expression. Something that will change everything. Before Ruth could respond, the orchestra Colin had hired, the same one that had played at their wedding, struck up their anniversary waltz. The crowd parted as Colin approached, his navy tuxedo impeccable, his smile camera-ready. But Ruth knew him well enough to see the tension in his jaw, the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for hers. "May I have this dance with my beautiful wife?" he asked, loud enough for their guests to hear and applaud. Ruth placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her to the center of the ballroom. As they began to move, she wondered if he could feel the weight of her scrutiny. 20 years of marriage had taught her to read him like a balance sheet, identifying assets and liabilities with equal precision. "You're trembling," she murmured as they turned, their bodies moving through the familiar steps they'd practiced for their wedding day. "Excitement," he replied, but his green eyes, the ones that had once looked at her with such convincing adoration, couldn't quite meet hers. "Tonight is special. So your mother keeps telling me." They danced in silence for a moment, and Ruth became acutely aware of their audience. She spotted Naomi Brooks, her business partner and best friend, watching from beside a marble column, her expression concerned. Gabriel Lawson was there too, the attorney who handled her interior design firm's contracts, his quiet presence somehow reassuring in the sea of Colin's associates. As the music swelled toward its conclusion, Colin suddenly stopped, keeping Ruth's hand in his but turning to face their guests. The orchestra faded to silence, and Ruth felt the air in the room shift, becoming dense with expectation. "Friends, family," Colin began, his voice carrying through the ballroom with the practiced ease of someone who had given 1,000 presentations. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate 20 years of marriage." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Ruth smiled the smile she'd perfected at 1,000 such events, even as her instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. 20 years, Colin continued, and Ruth noticed sweat beading at his temple despite the cool air. 20 years of building an empire, of creating a legacy. But you all know that a legacy isn't just about money or property. It's about family. It's about the future. Ruth's stomach tightened. She tried to withdraw her hand, but Colin's grip held firm. "And that's why tonight, on this special anniversary, I need to share something with all of you. Something that changes everything." The room held its breath. Ruth saw Margaret move closer, her pale eyes glittering with malicious triumph. "For years, Ruth and I have tried to have children," Colin said, and Ruth felt the blood drain from her face. They had agreed never to discuss this publicly, never to expose her private pain to the vultures who circled their social sphere. "It's been the great sadness of our marriage, the one thing our money couldn't buy, our influence couldn't secure." "Colin," Ruth whispered, a warning, a plea, but he continued as if she hadn't spoken. "But life," he said, his voice gaining strength, "life finds a way. And sometimes, when one door closes, another opens." He released Ruth's hand and turned toward the entrance of the ballroom. "Kerry, would you please join us?" The crowd parted, and Ruth watched with growing horror as Kerry Negger, Colin's 28-year-old secretary, walked toward them. But it wasn't Kerry's presence that made Ruth's world tilt on its axis. It was the obvious swell of her belly beneath her white designer dress, the protective way her hands cradled her pregnancy. "I want you all to know," Colin announced, his voice carrying over the gasps and whispers that had erupted, "that Kerry is 7 months pregnant, with my child, my son." The silence that followed was absolute, as if the entire room had suddenly been vacuum-sealed. Ruth stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the words, to understand how her life had just detonated in front of 300 witnesses. "I know this is unconventional," Colin continued, reaching out to take Kerry's hand, drawing her closer. "But sometimes love doesn't follow the rules we set for it. Sometimes destiny has other plans." That's when Margaret stepped forward, her voice cutting through the shocked murmurs. "Finally," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, her gaze fixed on Ruth with undisguised contempt. "Finally, my son will have a real heir. Not that it was ever going to happen with you, dear. How could it when you're barren?" The word echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. Barren. As if she were a field that had failed to yield crops, a disappointment to be discarded and replaced with more fertile ground. Ruth felt every eye in the room upon her, waiting for her reaction, waiting for her to scream, to cry, to beg, to rage. She could feel Colin watching her too, and in that moment she understood with crystalline clarity that this had all been choreographed. The public announcement, the dramatic reveal, Margaret's cruel pronouncement, all of it designed to humiliate her so thoroughly that she would crumble, would accept whatever terms they offered just to escape with some shred of dignity. But Ruth Farrell had not survived 5 miscarriages, 20 years in Margaret Condon's shadow, and building her own successful business by crumbling when men expected her to. She straightened her spine, feeling the architectural lines of her gown support her like armor. With deliberate grace, she reached for the champagne flute a stunned waiter was holding on a nearby tray. She raised it high, and the room held its breath. "To Colin," she said, her voice carrying with a clarity that surprised even her. "And to Kerry, may you have everything you deserve." She took a single sip, set the glass down on the nearest table with a decisive click, and turned to leave. The crowd parted before her like the Red Sea, their shock creating a clear path to the door. "Ruth!" Colin called after her, and she heard confusion in his voice. This wasn't in his script. "Ruth, wait! We need to discuss." She stopped at the threshold, turning back just enough for him to see her profile. "No, Colin, we don't." And then Ruth Farrell walked out of her marriage, her anniversary party, and her old life, her burgundy gown trailing behind her like blood from a wound that had finally been exposed to air. She didn't cry. She didn't stumble. She didn't look back. Behind her, the ballroom erupted in chaos, but Ruth didn't hear it. All she heard was the click of her heels on marble, measuring out the first steps of whatever came next. The valet brought her car. She'd insisted on driving herself tonight, some instinct warning her she might need an escape route. As she slid behind the wheel of her Mercedes, she caught a glimpse of herself in the rearview mirror. Her makeup was still perfect, her hair still elegantly styled. She looked like a woman who had just left a successful party, not a woman whose life had just imploded. Her phone buzzed incessantly, texts, calls, the digital chorus of scandal spreading through their social circle like wildfire. She turned it off without looking at any of them. There would be time for damage control later. Right now, she needed to think. She drove without destination, muscle memory navigating the familiar streets, while her mind worked through the implications of what had just happened. Colin had made a fatal error. In his arrogance, his need to control the narrative, he'd given her exactly what she needed, a public admission of adultery, witnessed by everyone who mattered in their social and business circles. He'd thought public humiliation would break her, make her pliable. Instead, he'd handed her a loaded weapon. Chapter 2. The legal storm begins. Dawn painted the sky the color of fresh bruises when Ruth Farrell signed the papers that would transform her from victim to warrior, her signature flowing across the page like a declaration of war. The law offices of Lawson and Associates occupied the 40th floor of a downtown high-rise, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city Colin Condon claimed to own. Ruth sat across from Gabriel Lawson, studying the man Naomi had insisted was the only attorney in the state who could take on the Condon empire and win. At 44, Gabriel carried his grief like a well-tailored suit, invisible to most but unmistakably present to those who knew what to look for. His brown eyes held a depth that spoke of personal loss, and his dark hair, peppered with premature grey, gave him an air of hard-won wisdom. He had the kind of quiet presence that made people lean in when he spoke, a stillness that suggested strength held in reserve rather than weakness. "Mrs. Condon," he began, but Ruth raised her hand. "Farrell," she corrected. "I'll be using my maiden name from now on." Gabriel nodded, making a note on the legal pad before him. His handwriting was precise, architectural, the penmanship of someone who understood that details mattered. "Miss Farrell, then. I've reviewed the preliminary information Naomi provided. Your husband's public announcement last night was—" He paused, searching for the appropriate legal term, "extraordinarily cruel." "It was strategic," Ruth replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. She'd spent the night in Naomi's guest room, staring at the ceiling and reconstructing the last 20 years of her life like a forensic accountant reviewing cooked books. "Colin doesn't do anything without calculating the return on investment. He wanted me destroyed publicly so I'd accept whatever settlement he offered privately." "What makes you think that?" Ruth reached into her handbag and withdrew a folder she'd been carrying for 3 years, her insurance policy, she'd called it in her mind, though she'd never imagined she'd need to use it. "Because Colin thinks I'm just another pretty acquisition who signed whatever he put in front of me without reading it. He's wrong." Gabriel opened the folder, and she watched his expression shift from professional interest to sharp attention as he scanned the documents inside. "This is a copy of our prenuptial agreement," Ruth confirmed. "The one Colin had his attorney draft. Note clause 7b on page 12. Gabriel flipped to the page, his eyes moving rapidly across the text. When he looked up, there was something new in his expression, respect and perhaps a hint of admiration. The infidelity clause. If either party commits adultery, they forfeit all claims to marital assets acquired during the marriage. Colin was so concerned about protecting his assets from me that he insisted on the most ironclad fidelity clause his lawyer could draft, Ruth said, allowing herself a small smile. He never imagined it could work against him. His announcement last night was a public admission of adultery in front of 300 witnesses. Ruth leaned forward. "But that's not all. Turn to the last page." Gabriel did, and his eyebrows rose. "The signature lines. Look at the witness signature." "Kerry Negger," Gabriel read, and then looked up sharply. "His secretary witnessed your prenuptial agreement 5 years ago when she first started working for him. I doubt she even remembers. But Colin had her witness and notarize dozens of our personal documents. He trusted her completely." Ruth's voice hardened. "He's about to learn how expensive misplaced trust can be." Gabriel set down the papers and studied her with those quiet, intense eyes. "Ms. Farrell, I need to be clear about something. Colin Condon is one of the most powerful men in this state. He has connections in every court, influence with every judge. This won't be just a divorce, it'll be a war." "I'm counting on it," Ruth replied. "I've spent 20 years learning how Colin thinks, how he operates. I know where everybody is buried in his business empire because I helped him bury half of them. That's dangerous knowledge. Only if I use it recklessly." Ruth met his gaze steadily. "I'm not interested in revenge, Mr. Lawson. I'm interested in justice. There's a difference." Before Gabriel could respond, his office door burst open. His assistant, a usually composed woman named Caroline, looked flustered. "I'm sorry, Mr. Lawson, but—" Colin Condon pushed past her, his face flushed with anger, his usually perfect hair disheveled. Behind him came 2 men in expensive suits, his legal team, Ruth recognized. The sharks had scented blood in the water. "Ruth," Colin said, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Gabriel stood slowly, moving subtly to position himself between Colin and Ruth. "Mr. Condon, you need to leave. Any communication with my client should go through proper legal channels." "Your client?" Colin laughed, but there was no humor in it. "She's my wife. We don't need lawyers to sort this out." "Actually," Ruth said, standing as well, pleased to find her legs steady, "we do. You made sure of that when you decided to announce your infidelity at our anniversary party." Colin's jaw clenched. "That was—" I was trying to be honest. "To handle things with dignity." "Dignity?" Ruth laughed, and the sound was like glass breaking. "You announced your secretary's pregnancy at our anniversary party. Your mother called me Baron in front of everyone we know. Where exactly was the dignity in that, Colin?" "You don't understand," Colin said, his voice dropping to the smooth, persuasive tone that had closed 1,000 deals. "Kerry means nothing. She was a mistake. The baby, we can work something out. We always do." Ruth studied the man she'd shared her bed with for 20 years, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. The calculated vulnerability in his eyes, the rehearsed catch in his voice, it was all performance, as scripted as last night's announcement. "Mr. Jackson," Gabriel addressed one of Colin's lawyers, "I'm sure you've advised your client that this meeting is inappropriate. Ms. Farrell has retained counsel. All future communication goes through me." The older of Colin's two lawyers, a silver-haired man who looked like he'd stepped from the pages of a Brooks Brothers catalogue, cleared his throat. "Mr. Condon simply wanted to ensure that Mrs. Condon understands the situation fully. The prenuptial agreement is quite clear," Gabriel interrupted smoothly. "Particularly Clause 7B. I assume you're familiar with it, since your firm drafted it?" The lawyer's face went pale. "That clause was meant to protect your client's assets from his wife in case of her infidelity," Gabriel finished. "Yes, I'm sure it was. How unfortunate that it doesn't specify whose infidelity triggers the forfeiture." Colin's face darkened. "You think you're clever? I built an empire worth $500 million. You think some technicality in a contract is going to take that away from me?" "No," Ruth said quietly. "I think your arrogance is going to take it away from you, just like it took away our marriage." Colin stepped toward her, and Gabriel moved to block him, but Ruth raised her hand. "It's all right," she said to Gabriel, then faced her husband. "Say what you came to say, Colin." "I'm offering you a clean break," Colin said, his business voice now, all pretense of emotion gone. $20 million, the house in the Hamptons, your jewelry. You walk away quietly, and we can all move on with our lives." $20 million, Ruth repeated, "from an estate worth $500 million. "You didn't earn that money," Colin said. "I built this empire." "With whose connections?" Ruth asked softly. "Whose introductions at charity galas? Whose careful cultivation of the wives who influence their husbands to invest with you? Whose designs for your showcase properties that drew the celebrities and politicians you needed to impress?" Colin's jaw worked. "You were compensated for that. The lifestyle you've enjoyed was payment for services rendered," Ruth finished. "Is that what our marriage was, Colin? A business arrangement?" "You knew what you were getting into," Colin said coldly. "You wanted security, status. I gave you both." Ruth felt something shift inside her chest, the last fragile thread of whatever had connected her to this man finally snapping. "You're right," she said. "I did know what I was getting into. I knew I was marrying a man who valued acquisition over affection, who saw people as assets to be managed. What I didn't know was that I'd spend 20 years trying to fill the emptiness inside you with my love, only to watch you fill it with your secretary instead." Colin's face flushed. "Don't make this about emotion, Ruth. This is business." "Everything is business to you," Ruth replied. "Even our children." The room went still. Colin's lawyers exchanged glances, and Gabriel watched with sharp attention as Ruth continued. 5 miscarriages, Colin. 5 times I lost our children, and do you know what you said each time? We'll try again, like a failed business venture, just another deal that didn't close. That's not, Colin started, but Ruth wasn't finished. The 3rd one was a boy, she said, her voice steady despite the tears she refused to let fall. 16 weeks. They let me hold him. He was perfect, just too small, too early. You were in Singapore, closing a deal. You didn't come home for the funeral. You said you didn't want a funeral, Colin protested. I said I couldn't bear a public ceremony. I never said I didn't want you there. Ruth turned to Gabriel. I believe we're done here. Gabriel nodded. "Mr. Condon, gentlemen, my assistant will show you out." Colin's younger lawyer, hungry-looking and sharp-eyed, spoke up. "We'll bury you in paperwork. Discovery alone will cost more than you'll ever recover." "Actually," Gabriel said mildly, "discovery should be quite interesting. I'm particularly looking forward to reviewing Mr. Condon's financial records. All of them." Something in his tone made Colin's lawyers exchange another glance. Colin himself had gone very still. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," Gabriel replied. "I'm simply stating that in a divorce of this magnitude, full financial disclosure is required. Every account, every transaction, every irregularity will be examined." "There are no irregularities," Colin said, but Ruth heard the slight uncertainty in his voice. "Then you have nothing to worry about," Gabriel said pleasantly. "Caroline, please show these gentlemen out." Colin looked at Ruth one last time. "You're making a mistake. I'm offering you a generous settlement. Take it, or you'll get nothing." Ruth met his gaze steadily. "I've already had nothing, Colin. 20 years of nothing dressed up as everything. I think I'll take my chances with the truth instead." After they left, Ruth sank back into her chair, suddenly exhausted. Gabriel poured her a glass of water from a crystal pitcher, and she accepted it gratefully. "You did well," he said quietly. "But he's right about one thing. This is going to get ugly." "It already is ugly," Ruth replied. "I'm just finally admitting it." Gabriel returned to his seat, picking up his legal pad. "Tell me about the financial irregularities." Ruth smiled grimly. "How much time do you have?" "As much as you need," Gabriel replied, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet strength that reminded her of still water running deep. "Colin has been keeping 2 sets of books for years," Ruth began. "One for the IRS, one for his investors." "I know because I've seen both." Gabriel's pen stopped moving. "You have proof?" "I have better than proof," Ruth said, reaching into her bag again. "I have the passwords to his private servers. Colin always said I had no head for business, so he never bothered to change them after showing me how complicated his work was." "Ms. Farrell," Gabriel said slowly, "are you telling me you have access to evidence of financial fraud?" "I'm telling you that Colin Condon built his empire on a foundation of lies, and I know where every crack in that foundation is." She met his eyes. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, and Ruth saw him weighing options, calculating risks. Finally he spoke. "We're going to need help, federal help. This is bigger than a divorce." "I know," Ruth said. "That's why I chose you. Naomi said you used to work for the Justice Department before." She trailed off, realizing she was approaching personal territory. "Before my wife got sick," Gabriel finished quietly. "Yes, I did. I still have contacts there." "I'm sorry," Ruth said. "About your wife?" Gabriel nodded, his eyes distant for a moment. "Cancer doesn't announce itself at anniversary parties, but the result is the same. Everything changes in an instant." They sat in silence for a moment, 2 people who understood loss in different ways. Chapter 3. Evidence and Empathy. The USB drive weighed no more than a breath, but as Ruth placed it on Gabriel's desk, she felt the gravity of 20 years of secrets shift the very air in the room. It was past midnight, 2 weeks after that first meeting, and the law offices of Lawson and Associates had taken on the quality of a war room. Boxes of documents lined the walls, laptops hummed with activity, and the conference table was buried under financial statements that told the story of Colin Condon's empire in numbers that didn't quite add up. Gabriel had loosened his tie, his jacket draped over his chair, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked with ink stains from hours of note-taking. Ruth had never seen him as anything but perfectly composed, but tonight there was something different about him, an intensity that made him seem more real, more human. "What's on it?" he asked, not touching the drive yet. as if he understood its significance. "Everything," Ruth replied, settling into the chair across from him. She'd changed from her business suit into jeans and a cashmere sweater, having learned that revenge required comfort as much as courage. 7 years of emails between Colin and his accountant discussing how to hide assets, recorded conversations from his home office. Connecticut is a one-party consent state, and I was always that party. Documentation of bribes to city officials for zoning permits. And a particularly interesting series of messages between Colin and Margaret about moving money offshore. Gabriel picked up the drive, turning it over in his fingers. Ruth, this is dangerous. If Colin finds out you have this—" "He won't," Ruth interrupted. "Colin's greatest weakness has always been his assumption that everyone else is as stupid as he believes them to be. He taught me how to use his computer systems, showed me his filing methods, even gave me his passwords, all while explaining how I shouldn't worry my pretty head about such complicated matters." A ghost of a smile crossed Gabriel's face. "He underestimated you." "Everyone does," Ruth said simply. "It's been my greatest advantage." Gabriel inserted the drive into his laptop, and Ruth watched his expression change as he began scrolling through the files. His eyes sharpened, his jaw tightened, and occasionally he would make a note on the legal pad beside him. "This offshore account," he said after several minutes, "it's registered to a shell company in the Caymans." "Condon Holdings International," Ruth confirmed. "Allegedly for foreign investments, actually for hiding money from the IRS. Check the folder labeled Paradise." Gabriel clicked through, then stopped, staring at the screen. "These numbers—" $47 million, Ruth said. "Hidden from our marital assets, hidden from the government, hidden from his investors. Colin's been skimming from his development projects for years, billing for materials and labor that were never provided, then moving the money offshore." "This is federal crime territory," Gabriel said quietly. "Wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering." "I know," Ruth said. "I've had 3 years to think about what to do with this information. I kept telling myself I was staying for love, that things would get better, but really, I think I was waiting." "For what?" "For him to give me a reason to use it." She laughed bitterly. "I suppose I should thank him for the anniversary party. He made it so easy." Gabriel looked up from the screen, studying her with those thoughtful brown eyes. "You've been planning this for 3 years?" "Not planning," Ruth corrected. "Preparing. There's a difference. I hoped I'd never need to use any of this. I wanted our marriage to work. I wanted the man I married to come back." She paused, her fingers tracing patterns on the polished wood of his desk. "But that man never existed, did he? I married a fiction that Colin performed until he got what he wanted." "What did he want?" "Respectability, connections. My father was a federal judge before he died. My mother's family owned half the historical properties in Connecticut. Colin was new money, desperate to become old money. I was his ticket to legitimacy." Gabriel closed the laptop carefully. "Ruth, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest." She nodded. "Is any of this about revenge?" Ruth considered the question, appreciating that he'd asked it. "Yes," she said finally, "but not the way you might think. I don't want to destroy Colin just to watch him burn. I want him to face consequences for the first time in his life. I want him to understand what it feels like to have everything you've built taken away by someone you trusted. That's still revenge. Maybe, but it's also justice. How many contractors has Colin refused to pay, claiming their work was substandard? How many small businesses has he crushed to build his developments? How many investors has he deceived?" She leaned forward. "I've watched him destroy people for 20 years, Gabriel. Good people who did nothing wrong except trust Colin Condon. So yes, maybe I want revenge, but mostly I want him stopped." Gabriel was quiet for a moment, then reached for his phone. "I need to call my contact at the FBI. This is going to trigger a federal investigation." "Wait," Ruth said, and he paused. "There's something else you should know. Kerry Nager, she's not his first affair." Gabriel set down the phone. "How many?" "That I know of?" "7. But Kerry's different. She's the first one he got pregnant, or at least the first one he kept pregnant." "What do you mean?" Ruth's voice hardened. "I mean Colin has paid for at least 3 abortions that I know of. Cash payments to a private clinic in Manhattan. It's all in the files. But Kerry refused. She wanted the baby. Colin tried to pay her off, but she threatened to go public. So he did what Colin always does. He changed the narrative. Made it seem like his idea, his choice, turned it into another acquisition to add to his portfolio." "Do you have proof of the payments?" "Check the file marked medical. You'll find the receipts. He was stupid enough to keep them for tax purposes, claiming them as medical expenses for employees." Gabriel pulled up the file, his expression darkening as he read. "This is... God, Ruth. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry for me," Ruth said. "Be sorry for Kerry. She thinks she's won something. She has no idea she's just become Colin's newest prisoner." As if summoned by her name, Gabriel's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, frowning. "Speak of the devil. Kerry Nager is in the lobby. She wants to talk to you." Ruth straightened. "Kerry's here. At midnight. Security says she's distressed. Should I have them send her away?" Ruth considered for a moment. "Number, send her up. This should be interesting." 5 minutes later, Kerry Nager entered Gabriel's office, and Ruth was struck by how young she looked. 28 years old, 7 months pregnant, and despite the designer maternity dress and expensive jewelry Colin had obviously lavished on her, she looked like a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. "Ruth," Kerry began, then stopped, seeming to realize the inappropriateness of the familiarity. "Mrs. Condon." "Ms. Farrell," Ruth corrected gently. "Sit down, Kerry. You shouldn't be standing in your condition." Kerry sank into a chair, her hands protective over her belly. Up close, Ruth could see she'd been crying. Her perfect makeup was smudged, her eyes red and swollen. "He's not what I thought," Kerry said without preamble. "Colin, he's not who I thought he was." "No," Ruth agreed. "He never is. He told me you were cold, that your marriage had been over for years, that you had an arrangement." "We did have an arrangement," Ruth said. "It was called marriage. I honored it. He didn't." Kerry's face crumpled. "I found something. On his computer. He gave me his passwords, said we shouldn't have secrets if we were going to be a family." Ruth exchanged a glance with Gabriel. "What did you find?" Kerry pulled out her phone with shaking hands, showing them a screenshot of an email. "He's been writing to someone named Ashley, a yoga instructor in Los Angeles. He's been saying the same things to her that he said to me, about leaving his cold wife, about starting fresh, about building a life together." "When was this email sent?" Gabriel asked. 3 days ago, after the anniversary party, after he announced I was pregnant in front of everyone." Kerry's voice broke. "He's already planning to replace me, isn't he? Just like he replaced you." Ruth studied the young woman across from her, really looked at her for the first time. Not as the other woman, not as the enemy, but as another victim of Colin Condon's particular brand of cruelty. "Kerry," Ruth said carefully, "what do you want?" "I don't know," Kerry whispered. "I thought I wanted Colin. I thought I wanted this life, but now I'm scared. He's been different since the announcement. Colder. He gets angry when I ask about the nursery, about the wedding he promised. His mother—" She trailed off. "Margaret," Ruth supplied. "Let me guess. She's been less than welcoming." "She called me a gold-digging whore," Kerry said flatly. Said I'd never be a real Condon wife, just the vessel for her grandson. Charming as ever, Ruth murmured. Then, making a decision that surprised even her, she leaned forward. Kerry, listen to me very carefully. You have two choices. You can stay with Colin, have his baby, and spend the rest of your life fighting for scraps of his attention and money. Or you can help us. Help you? Kerry looked confused. Why would you want my help? Because you have access Colin doesn't know about. Because you're invisible to him now. Just another acquisition he's already secured. And because... Ruth paused, meeting Kerry's eyes. You deserve better than what he's planning for you. What is he planning? Gabriel spoke up. Based on the prenuptial agreement he'll inevitably ask you to sign. Limited financial support for you and the child, no claim to his assets, and a custody arrangement that gives him full control. Kerry's hand went to her belly. He can't take my baby. He can if you sign the wrong papers, Ruth said. But we can help you, if you're willing to help us. What would I have to do? Ruth looked at Gabriel, who nodded slightly. Document everything, every conversation, every transaction, every meeting. Colin's about to be under federal investigation. The more evidence we have, the stronger the case. Federal investigation? Kerry's eyes widened. For what? Financial fraud, tax evasion, bribery, Gabriel listed. Your boyfriend isn't just unfaithful, Ms. Negger, he's a criminal. Kerry was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Finally, she looked up. He had me sign things, papers I didn't read, said they were for insurance, for the baby's future. What if I'm implicated? We can protect you, Gabriel said. If you cooperate with the investigation, we can ensure you have immunity. And my baby will be provided for, Ruth said. I'll make sure of it personally. Kerry studied Ruth's face. Why would you do that? I slept with your husband. I'm carrying his child. Because you're 28 years old, and Colin Condon has been perfecting his manipulation techniques since before you were born, Ruth said simply. Because that baby didn't ask for any of this. And because the best revenge against Colin isn't destroying him, it's protecting the people he's hurt. Kerry started crying then, really crying, her shoulders shaking with the force of it. Ruth moved around the desk, kneeling beside her chair, and did something that surprised them all. She took Kerry's hand. It's going to be okay, Ruth said softly. You're not alone in this. Gabriel watched this scene, the betrayed wife comforting her husband's pregnant mistress, with something like awe. Later, he would tell Ruth it was the moment he began to fall in love with her, though neither of them would acknowledge it for months to come. Chapter 4. The Grandmother's Wisdom. Stella Farrell's hands moved through bread dough like a pianist through a familiar sonata, each fold and press a meditation that had sustained her through 70 years of joys and sorrows. Ruth sat at the kitchen table of her grandmother's house in Savannah, the same table where she'd done homework as a child, where she'd announced engagement to Colin, where she'd cried after her first miscarriage. The morning sun streamed through windows lined with bottles of colored glass, casting rainbow patterns across the flour-dusted surface. You always come home when you're hurting, Stella said without turning around, even when you don't admit you're hurt. I'm not hurt, Grandma, Ruth replied automatically. I'm angry. Stella shaped the dough into a loaf with practiced efficiency. Anger's just hurt that's learned to fight back. Question is, who you fighting, Colin or yourself? Ruth traced a finger through the flour on the table, drawing patterns she didn't recognize. He announced his secretary's pregnancy at our anniversary party, in front of everyone. I heard. Stella covered the dough with a clean towel and finally turned to face her granddaughter. At 70, she moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had learned not to waste motion or words. Her face, lined with decades of laughter and tears, held the kind of beauty that transcended age. Also heard you walked out with your head high and didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing you break. How did you? Naomi called. That girl loves you like a sister, said you're staying with some lawyer now, planning to take Colin for everything he's worth. Gabriel Lawson, he's helping with the divorce. Stella poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that was always brewing, adding cream and sugar to Ruth's without asking. Some things never changed. Tell me about him. Gabriel? He's competent, thorough. He used to work for the Justice Department. That's not what I asked. Ruth looked up, meeting her grandmother's knowing eyes. He lost his wife, cancer, 3 years ago. So he knows about grief. Yes, and he looks at you how? Grandma, baby girl, I've got 7 decades of watching people. I know when a man's looking at a woman with interest and when he's looking at her with recognition. Which is it? Ruth considered lying, but Stella had always seen through her facades. Recognition, I think. Like he sees something in me that he understands. The wounded recognize the wounded, Stella said, settling into her chair with the careful movements of someone whose bones remembered every year. Your grandfather was like that. First time I met him, after your daddy's father passed, he didn't try to fix me or save me. He just saw me, all of me, the broken parts and the parts still standing. This isn't about romance, Grandma. It's about divorce, about justice. Is it? Stella sipped her coffee. Tell me, what you planning to do when you've got Colin's money and he's in whatever prison they put rich white folks in? I haven't thought that far ahead. Haven't you? Ruth Marie Farrell, you've been planning your whole life. Even as a little girl, you had lists and strategies and backup plans for your backup plans. You telling me you're going into battle against your husband without knowing what victory looks like? Ruth was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear the familiar sounds of the neighborhood waking up, dogs barking, cars starting, children calling to each other. This street hadn't changed in 40 years, a pocket of constancy in a world that seemed to shift beneath her feet daily. I found out about the others, she said finally. The other women. 7 that I know of. 3 who got pregnant. Colin paid for them to take care of it. Stella's face didn't change, but her hand reached across the table to cover Ruth's. I'm sorry, baby. The one who's pregnant now, Kerry, she refused to get rid of it. So Colin decided to claim it, make it part of his grand narrative. His legacy. Ruth laughed bitterly. 5 times I miscarried, Grandma. 5 times. And each time he acted like it was my failure. Like I was defective merchandise. You are not defective, Stella said firmly. You are not merchandise. You are my granddaughter, descended from women who survived slavery, who built schools during Reconstruction, who marched for civil rights, who raised families and ran businesses and changed the world one stubborn step at a time. You are not defined by what your body couldn't do or what that man couldn't see. I know that. Intellectually, I know that. But sometimes knowing and feeling are 2 different countries with no bridge between them. Stella squeezed her hand. Tell me about the baby, the boy, the one at 16 weeks. Ruth's breath caught. She'd never told anyone about that, not even Naomi. How did you? I know my granddaughter. I know which losses carved the deepest grooves in your heart. Tell me. He was perfect, Ruth whispered. 10 fingers, 10 toes. They let me hold him for an hour. The nurse took pictures, made handprints and footprints. I named him Samuel, after great-grandfather. Colin never knew. He was in Singapore, and when he came back, I just told him I'd lost the baby. He never asked for details. Where are the pictures? In a safety deposit box, along with the divorce papers I've had drawn up 3 times over the years, but never filed. Why didn't you? File, I mean. Ruth pulled her hand back, wrapping both around her coffee cup. Because I thought if I tried harder, loved better, became whatever he needed, maybe he'd love me back. Maybe we'd have the family I dreamed of. Can't love someone into loving you back, baby. Love ain't a currency that earns interest. It's a gift, freely given, or it's nothing at all. I know that now. Do you? Because seems to me you're still trying to earn something from Colin. Maybe not his love anymore, but something. Respect, Ruth said after a moment. I want him to respect me, to see that I'm not the fool he took me for. And then what? When you've got his respect, his money, his empire all laid at your feet, then what? Ruth didn't have an answer for that. Stella stood, moving to the window that overlooked her garden. Even in late fall, it bloomed with stubborn life. Winter vegetables, cold hardy flowers, herbs that perfumed the air. Your grandfather planted that magnolia tree the day your father was born, she said, lived through hurricanes, droughts, even survived when they built that highway and killed half the trees on the street. You know why? Deep roots, Ruth said. It was a familiar story, one she'd heard throughout her childhood. Deep roots, yes, but more than that. It bends. Every storm that comes through, that tree bends almost to breaking, but it doesn't break. And when the storm passes, it straightens back up. A little scarred, maybe, but still reaching for the sun. I'm not a tree, Grandma. No, you're not. You're something stronger. You're a black woman who survived 20 years in a world that told you every day you weren't enough. Not white enough for Colin's mother, not fertile enough for Colin's legacy, not broken enough to disappear like he wanted you to. Stella turned from the window. So, I'll ask you again. What are you fighting for? Justice? Revenge? Or are you fighting to remember who you were before Colin Condon tried to remake you in his image? Before Ruth could answer, her phone buzzed. Gabriel's name appeared on the screen. Take it, Stella said, but remember what I said. Ruth stepped onto the back porch to answer. Gabriel. Ruth, where are you? His voice was tense, worried. Savannah, at my grandmother's. I needed to think. You need to come back. Now Colin's made a move. What kind of move? He's filed a motion claiming you're mentally unstable, that your actions since the anniversary party prove you're having a breakdown. He's trying to have you declared incompetent. Ruth's hand tightened on the phone. He's what? There's more. He's got affidavits from 3 psychiatrists claiming you've been under their treatment for severe depression and paranoid delusions. I've never seen a psychiatrist in my life. I know, they're fabricated, but one of them has hospital letterhead from when you were admitted for your miscarriages. He's using your grief against you, Ruth. Ruth felt something cold and sharp crystallize in her chest. I'll be there in 3 hours. Ruth, 3 hours, Gabriel. She hung up and found Stella standing in the doorway, having heard everything. Now, her grandmother said quietly, now you know what you're fighting for. What? The truth. Your truth. The truth of who you are and what you've survived. That man wants to rewrite your history, make you the crazy woman who couldn't handle his success. You going to let him? No. Then you better get moving. But Ruth? Yes, Grandma. Remember that magnolia tree. The storm's here, baby. Time to show how deep your roots really go. Ruth hugged her grandmother, breathing in the familiar scent of flower and lavender that had meant safety her entire life. I love you. I love you too, baby. Now go show that man what we're made of. The drive back to Connecticut gave Ruth time to think, to plan. Colin had made a critical error. In trying to paint her as crazy, he'd revealed his desperation. The mental incompetence claim meant he was scared of what she knew, what she could prove. It also meant he was willing to use her deepest pain, the loss of their children, as a weapon against her. By the time she reached Gabriel's office, she had her strategy mapped out. Colin wanted to question her sanity? Fine. She'd give him, and the court, such a clear view of her mental state that his lies would crumble like tissue paper in rain. Gabriel was waiting in his office, files spread across his desk, his tie loosened, and his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He looked up when she entered, and she saw relief flash across his face. "You're here." "I'm here, and I'm ready to fight." He studied her for a moment, and she wondered what he saw. The wronged wife, the grieving mother, or something else, something harder and more determined. "Good," he said finally, "because I've been doing some digging. Those psychiatrists Colin cited, 2 of them have been paid consultants for his company. The 3rd is his golf buddy. We can prove the connections, prove the conflict of interest." "That's not enough," Ruth said. "We need to do more than defend. We need to attack." "What do you have in mind?" Ruth smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had found her strength in the midst of her storm. "Colin wants to talk about mental health. Let's talk about his. Let's talk about the narcissistic personality disorder that 3 different marriage counselors suggested he might have. Sessions he walked out of, by the way. Let's talk about his cocaine use in the early 2000s, which I have receipts for. Let's talk about the violent outbursts that left holes in our bedroom wall, which I have photos of." Gabriel's eyes widened. "You documented all of that?" "My grandmother taught me to keep records. Memory fades," she always said, "but paper remembers. I have 20 years of paper, Gabriel. 20 years of evidence that Colin Condon is exactly who I say he is. This changes everything. With this, we can not only fight the incompetence claim, we can go on the offensive." Ruth moved to the window, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the growing darkness. "Kerry called me. She's scared. Colin's been pressuring her to sign papers, threatening to abandon her if she doesn't. We can file for a protective order. Number, let him threaten her. Let him show his true colors. The more desperate he gets, the more mistakes he'll make." She turned back to Gabriel. "I want to offer Kerry something. Full immunity in exchange for her testimony, plus a trust fund for the baby. Enough to ensure she never has to depend on Colin for anything." "That's generous. It's strategic. Colin's worst nightmare isn't losing his money, it's losing control. If Kerry testifies about his attempts to coerce her, about the other women, about the payments for abortions, his reputation won't just be damaged, it'll be destroyed." Gabriel was quiet for a moment, then said, "There's something else." "My contact at the FBI called. They've been investigating Colin for 6 months already. Your evidence just gave them what they needed to move forward. They want to meet with you." "When?" "Tomorrow morning." Ruth nodded. "Then we'd better get prepared." They worked through the night, organizing documents, preparing statements, building a case that would withstand any attack Colin might launch. As dawn broke through the windows, Ruth realized she wasn't tired. If anything, she felt more energized than she had in years. "You should rest," Gabriel said, looking at her with concern. "The meeting's in 3 hours." "I'll rest when this is over," Ruth replied. Then, softer, "Thank you. For everything." "You don't have to thank me. This is my job." "No," Ruth said, meeting his eyes. "It's more than that, and we both know it." Something passed between them then, an acknowledgement of the connection that had been building since that first meeting. But this wasn't the time for whatever was growing between them. This was the time for war, and Ruth Farrell was ready to win. Chapter 5. The Courtroom Battle. "Your Honor, my client is clearly suffering from delusional episodes brought on by the trauma of her repeated miscarriages and the shock of learning about her husband's relationship with Ms. Negger." Colin's attorney, William Jackson, delivered the words with the practiced sincerity of a man who had assassinated hundreds of characters in dozens of courtrooms. He stood before Judge William Hayes, a silver-haired man whose expression remained carefully neutral despite the circus this divorce had become. Ruth sat beside Gabriel, her posture perfect, her face calm. She wore a simple black suit that emphasized her dignity rather than her wealth. Gabriel's suggestion, and a good one. Across the aisle, Colin sat with his team of 3 lawyers, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. Kerry was notably absent, though Ruth knew she was waiting in a nearby room, ready to testify if called. These alleged business irregularities she claims to have discovered, Jackson continued, are simply the fantasies of a woman desperate to punish her husband for finding happiness elsewhere. We have statements from 3 prominent psychiatrists. Objection, Gabriel said, rising smoothly. Those psychiatrists have never treated my client. Their statements are based entirely on second-hand information provided by Mr. Condon. Your Honor, Jackson said, the psychiatrists based their evaluations on documented incidents. What documented incidents? Gabriel interrupted. The hospital records from my client's miscarriages. Since when is grief a mental illness? Judge Hayes raised a hand. Gentlemen, let's maintain decorum. Mr. Jackson, do any of these psychiatrists have first-hand treatment experience with Ms. Farrell? Jackson hesitated. No, Your Honor, but then their statements are opinion, not medical fact. I'll allow them to be entered into evidence, but the court will weight them accordingly. Mr. Lawson, you may proceed with your response. Gabriel nodded. Your Honor, we'd like to call our first witness, Kerry Negger. The courtroom stirred as Kerry entered, visibly pregnant now at nearly 8 months, her hands trembling as she took the oath. She looked small in the witness box, overwhelmed by the weight of wood and tradition surrounding her. Ms. Negger, Gabriel began gently, can you tell the court about your relationship with Mr. Condon? Kerry's voice was barely above a whisper. We began seeing each other 2 years ago. He told me his marriage was over, that he and Ruth, Ms. Farrell, lived separate lives. Did you believe him? Yes. He was very convincing. He showed me texts that he said were from her, agreeing to the arrangement. I found out later he'd faked them. Colin shifted in his seat, and Ruth saw him mouth something to Jackson, who quickly stood. Objection. Speculation. I have the texts, Kerry said, stronger now, and I had them analyzed by a digital forensics expert. They were created on Colin's computer, not Ruth's phone. Continue, Judge Hayes said, his interest clearly piqued. When I told Colin I was pregnant, Kerry continued, he tried to convince me to terminate. When I refused, he threatened to fire me, to ruin my reputation. He said no one would believe a secretary over Colin Condon. What changed his mind? Kerry looked directly at Colin for the first time. I told him I'd recorded our conversations, all of them, including the ones where he talked about hiding money from the IRS. The courtroom erupted. Jackson shot to his feet, demanding the recordings be ruled inadmissible, while Colin's face turned an alarming shade of red. Judge Hayes had to gavel for order 3 times before the room settled. Ms. Negger, the judge said, do you have these recordings with you? Yes, Your Honor. My attorney has copies. What followed was devastating. For the next hour, the court listened to Colin's voice discussing offshore accounts, bribing city officials, and most damningly, his plans to hide assets before announcing his affair. I need Ruth to look like the crazy one, Colin's recorded voice said. If she's unstable, no one will believe her about the money. We'll get some friendly doctors to say she's been having episodes. Mother knows someone at the hospital who can adjust some records. Ruth watched Colin's face as his own words condemned him. This was the man she'd loved, or thought she'd loved, the man she'd tried to have children with, the man who had held her as she cried after each miscarriage, all while planning her destruction. When the recordings ended, Gabriel stood. Your Honor, we'd like to submit additional evidence regarding Mr. Condon's mental state. Objection! Jackson practically shouted. My client's mental health is not in question here. It is now, Gabriel replied calmly. Mr. Condon has accused my client of mental instability. We have the right to examine his own psychological fitness, especially given what we've just heard. Judge Hayes nodded. I'll allow it. Gabriel presented reports from 3 different marriage counselors, all suggesting Colin showed signs of narcissistic personality disorder. He submitted credit card records showing thousands of dollars in cocaine purchases. He showed photos of holes punched in walls, furniture destroyed in rages, a pattern of violence that Ruth had hidden for years. Ms. Farrell, Gabriel said, would you please take the stand? Ruth rose, smoothing her skirt, and walked to the witness box with measured steps. She'd testified in depositions, but this was different. This was public. This was the moment she reclaimed her narrative. Ms. Farrell, Gabriel began, Mr. Condon's team claims you're mentally unstable. How do you respond to that? Ruth looked directly at Colin as she answered, I've been many things in our 20-year marriage. Hopeful, heartbroken, disappointed, lonely, but never unstable. If anything, I've been too stable, too willing to accept the unacceptable in the name of preserving our marriage. Can you elaborate? I stayed silent when Colin had his first affair, 3 years into our marriage. I said nothing when I found charges for jewelry I never received, dinners at restaurants I'd never been to. I kept quiet about the verbal abuse, the gaslighting, the times he told me I was lucky he stayed with me despite my failure to give him children. Why did you stay silent? Ruth's voice was steady, clear. Because I believed marriage was sacred. Because I thought if I loved him enough, he would change. Because I was raised to believe that a strong woman could weather any storm. She paused. I was wrong. Some storms don't pass. Some storms just teach you to live in perpetual rain. Tell us about the miscarriages. This was the hardest part, but Ruth had prepared for it. 5 times I carried Colin's children. 5 times my body couldn't hold on to them. Each loss broke something in me that never quite healed. But I wasn't mentally ill. I was grieving. There's a difference. How did Mr. Condon respond to these losses? The first time, he held me while I cried. The second time, he was supportive but distant. By the third, he was frustrated. The fourth, he was in London and didn't come home. The fifth... She paused, gathering herself. The fifth was a boy. 16 weeks. Colin never even asked if it was a boy or a girl. He just said, we'll try again, like I was a machine that needed repair. And you documented all of this? Yes, in journals, in emails to friends, in therapy notes from the grief counselor I saw. A real therapist, not the fictional ones Colin created. Gabriel introduced her journals into evidence. 20 years of Ruth's private thoughts and pain laid bare for the court to see. It was humiliating and liberating in equal measure. Jackson cross-examined her brutally, trying to twist her words, to make her grief look like instability. Her preparation looked like obsession. But Ruth had spent 20 years learning to maintain composure under attack. She answered each question calmly, precisely, never rising to the bait. Isn't it true, Ms. Farrell, that you've been planning this divorce for years? That you've been gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to strike? No, Ruth said simply. I've been hoping for years that I wouldn't need a divorce. Every piece of evidence I collected was insurance I prayed I'd never have to use. Colin forced my hand when he announced his affair at our anniversary party. He wanted to humiliate me into submission. Instead, he freed me to tell the truth. The FBI agent testified next, confirming that Colin had been under investigation for 6 months, that Ruth's evidence had accelerated their case, that charges were imminent. Colin's face grew paler with each revelation. Then came the forensic accountant, who detailed exactly how Colin had hidden assets, moved money offshore, defrauded investors. The numbers were staggering. Nearly $60 million hidden or stolen over the course of a decade. Margaret Condon was called to testify, and her testimony was perhaps the most damaging of all. Under oath, faced with evidence of her own involvement in hiding assets, she crumbled. She admitted to helping Colin move money, to suggesting the mental incompetence strategy, to calling Ruth barren deliberately to provoke a reaction. "Why?" Gabriel asked her. Margaret's composure finally cracked. "Because she wasn't suitable. A black woman from the South with her people. Colin could have had anyone. Should have had someone appropriate." The courtroom was silent after that admission. Even Colin looked stunned by his mother's blatant racism. Judge Hayes called a recess, and Ruth found herself in the bathroom, splashing cold water on her face. Kerry entered, moving awkwardly with her pregnant belly. "I'm sorry," Kerry said, "for everything." Ruth turned to her. "You were 26 when it started. He was your boss, a millionaire who promised you the world. You don't need to apologize to me. He's going to jail, isn't he?" "Probably." Kerry's hand went to her belly. "What do I tell this child about their father?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. "You tell them the truth when they're old enough to understand it, that their father was a complicated man who made terrible choices, that they are not responsible for his sins, and that they have the chance to be better." When court reconvened, Judge Hayes delivered his ruling. The mental incompetence claim was dismissed with prejudice. The divorce would proceed, with full disclosure of all assets. Colin's hidden accounts would be frozen pending the criminal investigation. And most importantly, the prenuptial agreement's infidelity clause would be enforced. Colin lost everything in that moment: his empire, his reputation, his freedom. But as Ruth watched him being led away by federal agents, she felt no satisfaction. Only a hollow kind of peace, like the silence after a storm. Gabriel touched her elbow gently. "It's over." "No," Ruth said, watching Kerry waddle out of the courtroom, alone and afraid. "It's just beginning." Chapter 6. Unspoken Feelings. The restaurant Gabriel chose was deliberately understated. No Michelin stars, no month-long waiting list, just excellent food and quiet corners where two people could talk without being overheard or photographed. It had been 3 weeks since the courtroom victory, and Ruth was still adjusting to the strange rhythm of her new life. The media attention had been overwhelming at first, but Gabriel had helped her navigate it with the same quiet competence he'd shown throughout the trial. "You're not eating," he observed, watching her push risotto around her plate. "I'm thinking," Ruth replied. "Kerry had the baby yesterday." Gabriel set down his wine glass. "How is she?" "Scared. Alone. She named him James after her father." Ruth finally took a bite, barely tasting it. "I went to see them." "You went to the hospital. Someone had to. Colin's in federal custody. Margaret's fled to Switzerland to avoid charges, and Kerry's family disowned her when the scandal broke." She met his eyes. "The baby looks like Colin. Same green eyes, same stubborn chin. Kerry cried when she saw it." "That must have been difficult for you." Ruth considered this. "You'd think so, wouldn't you? The wronged wife, visiting her husband's bastard child. But when I looked at that baby, all I saw was innocence. He didn't choose any of this." Gabriel reached across the table, his fingers barely brushing hers. "You have an extraordinary capacity for grace. Or I'm a fool." "No." His voice was firm. "Never that." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Over the past months, Ruth had grown accustomed to Gabriel's presence, the way he listened without judgment, the way he fought for her without trying to fight instead of her, the way he looked at her like she was whole despite everything that had broken. "Tell me about your wife," Ruth said suddenly. Gabriel's hand withdrew slightly, but he didn't shut down, as she'd feared he might. "Lillian, we were married for 12 years. She was a pediatric surgeon, brilliant, funny, terrible at cooking, but insisted on trying anyway." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer on our anniversary. 6 months later, she was gone." I'm sorry. She would have liked you, Gabriel said. She had the same way of seeing through people's facades, getting to the truth underneath. She used to say I was too willing to see the best in people, that I needed someone who could spot the worst. Is that what you think I do? Spot the worst? I think you see clearly. No rose-colored glasses, no cynical assumptions. Just clarity. Ruth took a sip of wine, gathering courage. Gabriel, what are we doing? Having dinner. You know what I mean. He was quiet for a long moment, and Ruth watched him choose his words carefully. I think, he said slowly, that we're two people who've been through hell and are trying to figure out what comes after survival. I'm not ready, Ruth said, hating how vulnerable the words made her feel. I don't know if I'll ever be ready to trust someone again. I'm not asking you to trust me, Gabriel replied. I'm just asking you to let me be here in whatever capacity you need. Friend, lawyer, dinner companion, who makes sure you actually eat something. Ruth laughed, surprising herself. You're very persistent about the eating thing. You've lost 15 pounds since the anniversary party. Someone needs to be persistent. Have you been watching me that closely? Gabriel's eyes met hers, and there was something there that made her breath catch. Yes. The simple honesty of it undid something in her chest. Gabriel, I know, he said. You're not ready. You may never be ready. I'm not asking for anything, Ruth. I want you to know that when you look at me, I see you too. All of you. The grief, the strength, the anger, the grace. And none of it scares me away. Before Ruth could respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, frowning. It's Kerry. She says it's urgent. Go, Gabriel said immediately. I'll get the check. Come with me, Ruth said, surprising herself. I'd like you to come with me. They found Kerry in her hospital room, holding James and crying. When she saw Ruth, she held out a document with shaking hands. Colin's lawyer came, she said. He wants me to sign away my rights to any of Colin's assets in exchange for a one-time payment of $50,000. He said if I don't sign, he'll tie everything up in court for years, and James and I will get nothing. Ruth took the document, scanning it quickly. This is unconscionable. Colin's in federal custody. He can't. His mother sent it, Kerry interrupted. She's still controlling things from Switzerland. The lawyer said she has power of attorney. Gabriel took the document, his expression darkening as he read. This is legally questionable at best. Margaret fled the country to avoid prosecution. Her power of attorney could be challenged. I don't have money for lawyers, Kerry said desperately. I don't have anything. My apartment was in Colin's name. My car was a company car. Everything I had was his. Ruth made a decision that would have seemed impossible months ago. You'll stay with me. Both Kerry and Gabriel stared at her. I have a guest house, Ruth continued. It's been empty for years. You and James can stay there until you get on your feet. Why would you do that? Kerry whispered. Because Margaret Condon wants you destroyed, and I've had enough of that woman getting what she wants, Ruth said. And because that baby deserves better than being collateral damage in Colin's crimes. Kerry started sobbing then, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. Ruth sat on the bed beside her, carefully avoiding the various monitors and IV lines, and did something that surprised them all. She put her arm around Kerry's shoulders. It's going to be okay, Ruth said, and for the first time in months, she actually believed it. Gabriel handled the legal aspects, threatening Margaret's lawyer with charges of harassment and coercion. The document was withdrawn within hours, and Kerry was granted temporary support from Colin's frozen assets pending the outcome of his criminal trial. As they were leaving the hospital, Kerry now settled and calm, Gabriel touched Ruth's arm. What you did in there was the right thing to do. It was more than that. Ruth looked at him, this man who'd fought beside her through the worst period of her life, who'd seen her at her lowest and still looked at her like she was something precious. "Lillian was right," she said. "About what?" "You do see the best in people, even when they can't see it themselves." Gabriel smiled then, a real smile that transformed his usually serious face. "Maybe that's why we work." "We work? As friends," he said carefully. "For now." "For now," Ruth agreed, and if there was a promise in those words, neither of them acknowledged it. The next few weeks fell into a pattern. Kerry and James moved into the guest house, and Ruth found herself oddly comforted by their presence. She'd lived alone in the main house since Colin's arrest, and the empty rooms had begun to feel oppressive. Now there was life again. Baby cries at odd hours, the smell of formula and baby powder, Kerry's tentative attempts at cooking in the guest house kitchen. Gabriel came by regularly, always with a legal reason at first: papers to sign, updates on Colin's case, matters regarding the divorce settlement. But gradually, the pretense dropped. He'd bring dinner, claiming he'd ordered too much. He'd offer to help with repairs around the property, things Colin had let slide. He'd sit with Ruth on the porch in the evenings, comfortable silences punctuated by conversation that ranged from legal strategy to books to memories they were both learning to carry more lightly. One evening, as they watched Kerry walk James around the garden, Gabriel said, "You're healing. What makes you say that? You laugh now, really laugh, not the polite society laugh you perfected, and you've stopped checking your phone every 5 minutes for updates on Colin's case." Ruth considered this. "I suppose I have. When did you become so observant?" "I've always been observant. You're just letting me close enough to observe now." It was true, Ruth realized. Somewhere in the chaos of the past months, she'd stopped keeping Gabriel at arm's length. He'd become essential wasn't the right word. Present, constant, safe. "I'm thinking of selling the house," she said suddenly. Gabriel turned to look at her. "This house. Too many ghosts, too many rooms where awful things were said, where dreams died." She gestured to the garden. "I keep thinking I see Colin everywhere, in his study, at the breakfast table, in the bedroom. Where would you go?" "I don't know. Somewhere without history. Somewhere I can be just Ruth, not Colin Condon's ex-wife or that woman from the scandal." "That's going to be hard to find. The story went national." "I know." She pulled her knees up to her chest, a childlike gesture that made her seem younger than her 42 years. "Maybe I'm running away. Or maybe you're running towards something." Before Ruth could ask what he meant, Kerry appeared with James, who was fussing. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but he won't settle. I've tried everything." Ruth held out her arms. "May I?" Kerry handed over the baby, and Ruth settled him against her chest, humming softly. Within minutes, James was quiet, his tiny fingers wrapped around one of hers. "You're good with him," Kerry said wonderingly. "I had a lot of practice in my dreams," Ruth replied softly. Gabriel watched her hold the baby, saw the way her face softened, the way her body naturally curved to protect the small life in her arms. Later, he would tell her that was the moment he knew he was in love with her, watching her hold her husband's child by another woman with such tenderness it took his breath away. But that confession would come later. For now, he simply said, "You'd be a wonderful mother." Ruth looked up at him, tears she hadn't expected blurring her vision. "I'm 42 years old." "So?" "So that ship has sailed." "Has it? There are other ways to become a mother, other paths to family." Ruth looked down at James, then at Kerry, who was watching them with an expression of desperate hope, then at Gabriel, who saw everything she couldn't say. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe there are." Chapter 7. The Truth Unveiled. The FBI raid on Condon Industries happened at dawn on a Tuesday, synchronized across 17 locations in 3 states, and Ruth watched it unfold from her kitchen window while making coffee. She'd known it was coming. Gabriel's contact at the bureau had given them 12 hours' notice, but seeing the black SUVs stream into Colin's corporate headquarters across the city skyline still felt surreal. This was the empire Colin had killed their marriage to protect, and now it was crumbling like sand. Gabriel arrived an hour later with a box of pastries and a grim expression. "They found more than we expected." Ruth poured him coffee, noting how comfortable he'd become in her kitchen, how he knew where she kept the mugs and the cream. "How much more?" Colin wasn't just embezzling and hiding assets. He was running a full Ponzi scheme, taking money from new investors to pay off old ones, cooking the books to show profits that didn't exist. He pulled out his tablet, showing her the preliminary FBI report. The real estate empire? Built on paper. Half the properties he claimed to own were leveraged 3 times over. Ruth sank into a chair. How long? At least 8 years. Maybe longer. 8 years, she thought back, trying to pinpoint when Colin had changed, when the man she'd married had become a stranger. But maybe that was the point. He'd never changed. She'd just finally seen who he'd always been. Carrie appeared in the doorway, James in her arms. She'd been living in the guest house for a month now, and the haunted look was beginning to fade from her eyes. "Is it true? What they're saying on the news?" "What are they saying?" Gabriel asked. "That Colin stole from pension funds, from retirement accounts of his own employees." Gabriel nodded grimly. "It's true." Kerry made a sound like a wounded animal. "I helped him. Oh God, I helped him. I processed those transfers. I thought, he said it was restructuring, that it was all legal." "You didn't know," Ruth said firmly. "He used you, just like he used everyone. They'll arrest me too." "No," Gabriel said. "You have immunity in exchange for your cooperation. That deal is ironclad." The phone rang, and Ruth answered, putting it on speaker when she saw it was the federal prosecutor. "Ms. Farrell, we need to discuss what else was found in Mr. Condon's private files." "What else?" Ruth asked, though something in the prosecutor's tone made her stomach clench. "Documents suggesting Mr. Condon was planning to have you declared mentally incompetent long before the anniversary party. Years of fabricated medical records, staged photographs meant to suggest instability, even a draft commitment order with a judge's signature, though we believe the signature is forged." Ruth felt the room spin slightly. Gabriel's hand found her shoulder, steadying her. "He was planning to have me committed?" "It appears so. The documents date back 3 years, around the time you started your interior design business, according to the timeline." 3 years. When she'd finally found success, independent of Colin, when her designs had won awards and attracted celebrity clients, when she'd stopped needing him. "There's more," the prosecutor continued. "We found correspondence between Mr. Condon and a doctor at a private psychiatric facility in Vermont. They were discussing long-term treatment options for a patient with persistent delusions of independence." Ruth laughed, but it was a broken sound. "Delusions of independence, is that what he called it?" After the prosecutor hung up, Ruth stood abruptly, needing to move. She paced to the window, staring out at the garden where she'd planted roses that Colin had said were too much trouble. "He was going to have me locked away," she said quietly. "If Kerry hadn't gotten pregnant, if he hadn't decided on the public humiliation route instead, I'd be in a psychiatric facility right now, drugged and forgotten while he took everything." "But you're not," Gabriel said, his voice fierce. "You're here, you're free, you won." "Did I?" Ruth turned to face him. "He stole years of my life, made me doubt my own mind, my own worth. Even now, knowing it was all lies, I still sometimes wonder if I'm too emotional, too difficult, too much." Kerry spoke up unexpectedly. "You're not too much. You're exactly enough. I've watched you these past weeks, how you've handled everything with such grace, how you took me in when you had every reason to hate me. You're the strongest person I've ever met." Ruth looked at the young woman holding Colin's child, and something shifted in her chest. We're all stronger than he thought we were. The next revelation came that afternoon, delivered by Ruth's accountant, who'd been reviewing the assets now unfrozen by the court. "There's something strange here," he said, spreading papers across Ruth's dining room table. "This account in your name, did you know about it?" Ruth looked at the statement. "Number, I've never seen this before. It was opened 22 years ago, before you married Colin. Regular deposits every month since then. The current balance is—" He paused, double-checking his figures. $8.7 million. "That's impossible." Gabriel leaned forward, studying the documents. "The deposits. They're from a trust. The Stella Farrell Trust." "My grandmother?" Ruth grabbed the papers, scanning them rapidly. "But she's a retired teacher. She doesn't have this kind of money." Except as they dug deeper, it turned out she did. Stella Farrell had been quietly investing for 50 years, turning her teacher's pension into a fortune through careful, patient growth. And she'd been putting money aside for Ruth since before she was born. Ruth called her grandmother immediately. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you needed to learn to stand on your own feet first," Stella said calmly. "Money makes people weak if they get it too easy. You needed to be strong first, then rich. All those years with Colin, struggling to maintain my independence, you weren't struggling for money, baby. You were struggling for your soul. There's a difference." Ruth started laughing and couldn't stop. All those years, Colin had held financial security over her head like a sword, and she'd been wealthy all along. "Besides," Stella continued, "if Colin had known about that money, he'd have found a way to steal it. This way, it was protected, waiting for you when you were ready." The FBI agent arrived that evening with more news. They'd arrested Margaret in Switzerland, getting her extradited on charges of conspiracy and fraud. She'd been Colin's partner in more than just hiding assets. She'd been actively involved in the Ponzi scheme, using her society connections to bring in new investors. "She was the one who suggested the mental incompetence strategy," the agent said. "We have emails dating back 5 years where she discusses ways to handle you if you became a problem." 5 years, Ruth repeated. "My third miscarriage was 5 years ago. According to the emails, that's when they started planning. Margaret saw your grief as weakness to exploit." Gabriel's hand found Ruth's under the table, squeezing gently. She squeezed back, drawing strength from his steady presence. But the biggest revelation came near midnight, when Kerry knocked on the door, James sleeping in her arms and her laptop under her arm. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "I was going through old files, trying to understand how I missed so much. And I found something." She opened the laptop, showing them a hidden folder she'd discovered on Colin's server. Inside were hundreds of documents, but one stood out: a life insurance policy on Ruth worth $50 million, with Colin as the sole beneficiary. "Look at the date it was purchased," Kerry said. Ruth looked. It was the day after her 5th miscarriage. The day she'd told Colin she couldn't try again, that her body and heart couldn't take another loss. "He was planning to kill me," she said, the words coming out remarkably calm. Gabriel was already on the phone with the FBI, but Ruth barely heard him. She was thinking about all the times Colin had suggested she seemed tired, that she should take sleeping pills, the vitamins he'd insisted she take for her health. The strange dizzy spells she'd had last year that stopped when she'd stopped taking his recommended supplements. "Ruth," Kerry said urgently, "there's more. There are searches in his browser history. Undetectable poisons, making suicide look convincing. Psychiatric drugs that cause heart failure." The FBI arrived within an hour, taking the laptop and immediately launching an investigation. They would later find evidence that Colin had indeed been slowly poisoning Ruth, not enough to kill her quickly, but enough to make her seem unstable, confused, weak. The vitamins he'd given her had contained low doses of psychiatric drugs that caused the symptoms he then used as evidence of her mental illness. Ruth sat in her garden as dawn broke, wrapped in a blanket, processing the magnitude of Colin's betrayal. Gabriel sat beside her, not speaking, just present. "He was going to kill me," she said finally. "If the pregnancy hadn't happened, if Kerry hadn't changed his plans, I'd be dead now." "But you're not," Gabriel said. "You're alive, you're free, and he's going to prison for the rest of his life." "I loved him," Ruth said, "and it wasn't a defense or an excuse, just a fact. I loved a man who was planning my murder." "You loved who you thought he was. That's not a weakness, Ruth. That's humanity." Ruth turned to look at him, this man who'd been beside her through every revelation, every betrayal, every small victory. "How do I trust anyone after this?" "You don't have to trust anyone," Gabriel said, "but maybe someday you might choose to, not because you have to, but because you want to. What if I choose wrong again? Then you'll survive, just like you survived this." "But Ruth," he turned to face her fully, "not everyone is Colin. Some people are exactly who they seem to be." "Are you?" "I try to be." They sat in silence as the sun rose higher, painting the garden gold. Kerry came out with James, who was fussing for his morning feeding. Ruth watched her care for the baby with genuine tenderness, this young woman who'd been caught in Colin's web just as surely as she had. "We're going to be okay," Ruth said, and she meant all of them, herself, Kerry, James, even Gabriel, with his quiet grief and patient heart. "We're all going to be okay." The FBI agent called an hour later. They'd found enough evidence to charge Colin with attempted murder, along with all the financial crimes. He would never see freedom again. Ruth hung up the phone and felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or relief, but a kind of emptiness. The man she'd married was worse than dead. He'd never existed at all. Chapter 8. The Fall of Colin Condon. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan had never seen a crowd quite like the one that gathered for Colin Condon's sentencing 5 months after his arrest that had shocked the financial world. Ruth sat in the front row, flanked by Gabriel on one side and, surprisingly, Kerry on the other. The two women had formed an unlikely alliance over the months, bonded by their shared experience of Colin's manipulation. James was with Stella in Savannah. The courthouse was no place for a baby. Colin entered in shackles, and Ruth barely recognized him. The confident, commanding man she'd married had been replaced by someone hollow-eyed and grey, his expensive suit hanging loose on a frame that had lost 30 pounds. Prison had not been kind to Colin Condon. Margaret sat across the aisle, out on bail, but facing her own trial next month. She looked older, frailer, her usual severe elegance replaced by something desperate and brittle. She'd tried to approach Ruth earlier, but Gabriel had smoothly intercepted, making it clear that any communication should go through lawyers. The judge entered, not Hayes this time, but Judge Patricia Morgan, known for her no-nonsense approach to financial crimes and her particular distaste for men who abuse their power. "Mr. Condon," she began, her voice carrying the weight of authority, "you stand convicted of 43 counts of wire fraud, 18 counts of tax evasion, 12 counts of embezzlement, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted murder. Do you have anything to say before sentencing?" Colin stood, his lawyer helping him to his feet. When he spoke, his voice was nothing like the smooth, confident tone Ruth remembered. "I am innocent of these charges," he said, and Ruth heard Kerry make a disgusted sound beside her. "I've been framed by a vindictive ex-wife who couldn't accept that I'd found happiness elsewhere. Everything I built through honest work and—" "Mr. Condon," Judge Morgan interrupted, "I've reviewed the evidence. Hours of recorded conversations where you explicitly discuss defrauding investors. Documents in your own handwriting detailing the movement of stolen funds. Testimony from dozens of witnesses. If this is a frame-up, it's the most elaborate one in legal history." Your Honor, Colin's lawyer interjected, my client maintains. Your client can maintain whatever he likes, Judge Morgan said curtly. The facts speak for themselves. Mr. Condon, you stole from pension funds. You robbed retired teachers, firefighters, nurses of their life savings. You built an empire on lies and thought your wealth and connections would protect you from consequences. She paused, looking directly at Colin. You were wrong. The prosecutor stood to present the victim impact statements. One by one, people Colin had defrauded spoke about their losses, not just financial but personal. A retired teacher who'd lost her home. A young couple whose college funds for their children had vanished. A small business owner who'd been forced into bankruptcy. Then it was Ruth's turn. She stood slowly, smoothing her dress, a simple navy blue, professional but not flashy. She'd written her statement dozens of times, but now, facing Colin, she spoke from the heart. Your Honor, she began, her voice clear and steady, Colin Condon stole more than money from me. He stole 20 years of my life. He made me doubt my own mind, my own worth. He used my love as a weapon against me, and my grief as evidence of insanity. She looked directly at Colin for the first time in months. You had everything, wealth, success, a wife who loved you, the chance for a family, but it wasn't enough. It's never enough for men like you because there's nothing inside to fill. You're hollow, Colin. You always were. I just couldn't see it because I was too busy trying to pour love into an empty vessel. Colin's face flushed and he started to speak, but his lawyer stopped him. Ruth continued, But I want to thank you. Your cruelty freed me from a prison I didn't even know I was in. Your betrayal taught me my own strength. Your attempt to destroy me only revealed that I'm indestructible. She paused. I pity you, Colin. You had everything and appreciated nothing. Now you have nothing, and it's exactly what you deserve. She sat down, and Gabriel's hand found hers, squeezing gently. Kerry was crying silently beside her. Judge Morgan nodded. Thank you, Miss Farrell. Ms. Negger, would you like to speak? Kerry stood on shaking legs. Your Honor, I was 26 when Colin Condon became my boss. He was charming, powerful, everything I thought I wanted. He told me his marriage was over, that his wife was cold and unstable. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. She took a breath. I had his child thinking I was building a future with a good man. Instead, I discovered I was just another acquisition, another possession to be discarded when he got bored. He tried to buy my silence, to make me disappear. If it wasn't for Ruth Farrell's extraordinary grace in helping me, I don't know where my son and I would be. She looked at Colin. You're James's biological father, but you'll never be his dad. He'll grow up knowing his father was a criminal who cared more about money than people. But he'll also grow up knowing that two women who should have been enemies became allies to protect him from your poison. That's your real legacy, Colin. You brought together the people you tried to destroy. The judge called a recess before sentencing. In the hallway, Margaret approached, despite Gabriel's attempts to prevent it. Ruth, she said, her voice desperate. Please, I'm an old woman. Prison will kill me. Can't you find it in your heart? The same heart you called barren? Ruth interrupted. The same heart you tried to have locked away in a psychiatric ward? That heart? Margaret's face crumpled. I was protecting my son. You were enabling a monster, Ruth said. And you know what the saddest part is, Margaret? If you'd just accepted me, if you'd just been kind, none of this would have happened. Colin might have stayed the man I thought I married. But you fed his worst impulses, encouraged his cruelty, and now you both get to live with the consequences. Please, Margaret whispered. Ruth looked at the older woman, really looked at her. Beneath the desperation was something else, fear. Margaret Condon, who'd ruled her social circle with an iron fist, who'd never met a person she couldn't intimidate or buy, was terrified. "I hope you get the same mercy you showed me," Ruth said quietly. "Exactly the same." When court reconvened, Judge Morgan delivered her sentence. "Colin Condon, you are hereby sentenced to 45 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Additionally, all assets obtained through fraudulent means are to be liquidated and distributed to your victims." Colin swayed on his feet. 45 years. He'd be 90 if he lived to see freedom. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "you are ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $300 million. Any future earnings, inheritance, or assets you may acquire will go toward this restitution." "Your Honor," Colin's lawyer protested, "that amount is excessive." "That amount," Judge Morgan said firmly, "represents the lives Mr. Condon destroyed, the dreams he stole, the futures he obliterated. If anything, it's insufficient." As the bailiffs moved to take Colin away, he suddenly lunged toward Ruth, his face contorted with rage. "You did this!" he screamed. "You destroyed everything! You vindictive!" Gabriel moved instinctively, putting himself between Colin and Ruth, but the bailiffs were already restraining Colin, forcing him back. "I loved you," Colin shouted as they dragged him away. "I gave you everything." "No," Ruth said, standing tall. "You gave me nothing but lies. I gave myself everything that matters." The courtroom erupted as Colin was removed, still screaming threats and profanities. Margaret collapsed in her seat, sobbing. Kerry turned away, shielding herself from the ugliness of it all. Outside the courthouse, the media waited like hungry wolves, but Ruth was ready for them. "Ms. Farrell, how does it feel to see your ex-husband sentenced to 45 years? Ruth looked directly into the cameras. "I feel nothing for Colin Condon. He's a chapter in my life that's now closed. My focus is on the future, on rebuilding what he tried to destroy, on helping his victims recover what they can, and on moving forward with grace and purpose." "What about Kerry Negger and the baby?" "Ms. Negger is a brave young woman who was manipulated by a master manipulator. She and her son have my full support." "Are you planning to write a book? Sell your story?" "No," Ruth said firmly. "Colin Condon has taken enough of my life. I won't give him any more of my time or energy. This ends today." Gabriel stepped forward. "That's all. Ms. Farrell has no further comments." As they walked to the car, Kerry caught up with them. "Ruth, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I've decided to change James's last name to Farrell, if that's okay with you." Ruth stopped, stunned. "Kerry, you don't have to. You've been more of a parent to him in 5 months than Colin ever would have been. You and Stella, you're his real family. I want his name to reflect that." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes. "I would be honored." That evening, Ruth stood in her empty house. She'd finally sold it, the closing scheduled for next week. The movers had taken most of her things to the new brownstone she'd bought in a quiet neighborhood where no one knew her as Colin Condon's wife. Gabriel found her in what had been Colin's study, looking at the marks on the wall where his awards and photos had hung. "Any regrets?" he asked. "About Colin?" "Number about wasting 20 years? Sometimes." She turned to him. "But then I think about where I am now, who I've become, and I realize maybe nothing was wasted. Maybe it all led to this moment." "And what moment is that?" Ruth moved closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to smell his cologne. Subtle, warm, nothing like Colin's aggressive designer fragrances. "The moment where I choose what comes next," she said. "And what do you choose?" "I choose to stop being afraid. I choose to trust my own judgment. I choose—" She paused, gathering courage. "I choose to see where this thing between us might go." Gabriel's hand came up to cup her cheek, gentle, giving her every opportunity to pull away. "Are you sure?" No, Ruth said honestly. But I want to try. Is that enough? It's everything, he said, and kissed her. It was nothing like kissing Colin had been. No possession, no performance, no power play. It was soft and sure and felt like coming home after a long, terrible journey. When they pulled apart, Ruth laughed softly. Kerry and James are expecting us for dinner. Then we should go, Gabriel said, but he didn't move. Yes, Ruth agreed, not moving either. They stood there in Colin's former study, in the house where Ruth's marriage had died, and chose to begin something new. Outside, the sun set over Connecticut, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and hope. Chapter 9. The Final Gambit. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a courier who insisted on placing it directly into Ruth's hands, waiting while she signed for it with elaborate formality. Ruth recognized Margaret's handwriting immediately, the same elegant script that had graced 20 years of passive-aggressive Christmas cards and birthday notes. But this was different. The envelope was thick, official, with the logo of a Swiss law firm embossed in the corner. She was sitting in her new kitchen, the morning light streaming through windows that had never witnessed Colin's rages or Margaret's cutting remarks. Kerry was feeding James in the breakfast nook, and Gabriel was at the stove making his famous scrambled eggs, a domestic scene that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. "What is it?" Gabriel asked, noticing her stillness. Ruth opened the envelope carefully, pulling out a sheaf of legal documents. As she read, her face went pale. "Margaret's filed a competency claim," she said quietly. "She's arguing that Colin was mentally impaired when he committed his crimes, that he shouldn't be held fully responsible, and she's claiming I manipulated him into his deteriorated state through psychological abuse." Kerry gasped. "She can't be serious." "There's more," Ruth continued, scanning the documents. "She's hired a team of psychiatrists who are prepared to testify that Colin is suffering from induced delusional disorder brought on by years of manipulation from his calculating and vindictive wife. She's trying to get his sentence overturned." Gabriel set down the spatula, his expression darkening. "Let me see those." He read quickly, his frown deepening with each page. "This is sophisticated. She's not just throwing accusations around, she's built a case. Affidavits from Colin's business associates claiming you isolated him, testimony from household staff saying you controlled him, even a statement from a therapist claiming you exhibited signs of narcissistic abuse." "But none of that is true," Kerry protested. "Truth doesn't matter if perception becomes reality," Gabriel said grimly. "Margaret spent months and what must be millions on this. She's trying to flip the entire narrative." Ruth stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, her new neighbors went about their morning routines, blissfully unaware that her carefully rebuilt life was under attack again. "There's something else," she said. "Look at the date on the therapist's statement." Gabriel checked. 3 days ago. "Now look at the letterhead." He examined it more closely, then looked up sharply. "This is the same psychiatric facility Colin was planning to have you committed to." "Margaret's not just trying to free Colin," Ruth said. "She's trying to build a case to have me committed instead. If she can prove I'm the manipulative one, that I drove Colin to crime through psychological torture, she could potentially get conservatorship over you," Gabriel finished. "Control of your assets, your freedom, everything." The kitchen was silent except for James's happy babbling. Then Ruth laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "She learned from Colin's mistakes," she said. "He was too obvious, too public. Margaret's being surgical, professional. She's had months to plan while under house arrest." "What do we do?" Kerry asked, fear creeping into her voice. Ruth turned from the window, and both Gabriel and Kerry saw something shift in her expression, a hardening, a resolve that hadn't been there moments before. "We finish this," Ruth said, "once and for all." She pulled out her phone, dialing a number from memory. "Stella? It's me. I need you to send me the box from the attic. The one marked 1987. Yes, that one. Overnight it." "What's from 1987? Gabriel asked when she hung up. "Proof that Margaret Condon has been planning her son's crimes since before I ever met him." Ruth's smile was sharp as glass. "She made one mistake. She forgot that I spent 20 years in her house, listening to her stories, organizing her papers when she was too drunk at charity events to do it herself." The next 72 hours were a whirlwind of legal preparation. Gabriel called in favors from his Justice Department days, assembling a team of lawyers who specialized in complex fraud and competency cases. Ruth went through box after box of documents she'd quietly photocopied over the years, building a timeline that told a very different story than Margaret's narrative. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Colin's former accountant Marcus Webb reached out through Gabriel's office. He'd been granted immunity in exchange for testimony about the financial crimes, but he had more to offer. "I've been Colin's accountant for 15 years, he said, sitting in Gabriel's conference room, nervously adjusting his glasses. "But I was Margaret's accountant for 10 years before that." Ruth leaned forward. "Go on." "Margaret Condon has been committing financial fraud since the 1980s. Her first husband, Colin's father, didn't die of a heart attack. She poisoned him slowly with digitalis, making it look like heart failure. I have the receipts for the digitalis hidden in gardening supplies and correspondence where she discussed the plan with her lawyer, the same Swiss firm representing her now." The room was silent. Then Gabriel spoke. "You have proof of murder." Marcus pulled out a safety deposit box key. "Everything's in there. I kept it as insurance, but I was too scared to use it. Margaret Condon she's evil in a way that's hard to explain. She doesn't just destroy people, she makes them destroy themselves, and then stands back looking innocent." "Why come forward now?" Ruth asked. "Because she's trying to do to you what she did to Colin's father, and what she taught Colin to do to you." Marcus met her eyes. "I should have spoken up years ago. I'm sorry." Ruth studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Help us stop her, and we're even." The emergency hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. Margaret had pushed for an expedited process, confident in her carefully constructed case. She didn't know what was coming. The courtroom was packed. Margaret sat with her team of lawyers and expert witnesses, looking every inch the grieving mother fighting for her son. She'd even worn pearls, the same ones she'd worn to Ruth and Colin's wedding. "Your Honor," Margaret's lead attorney began, "we're here to present evidence that Colin Condon was systematically manipulated and psychologically abused by his wife, leading to a mental break that resulted in his criminal behavior." For 2 hours, they presented their case. The hired psychiatrists testified about induced delusional disorder, coercive control, and psychological manipulation. Former employees, clearly paid off, testified about Ruth's controlling behavior and emotional instability. Then it was Gabriel's turn. "Your Honor," he said, standing slowly, "we'd like to present evidence that Margaret Condon has been orchestrating financial fraud and worse for over 30 years, and that she trained her son in these criminal methods from childhood." Margaret's lawyer objected, but the judge, the same Patricia Morgan who had sentenced Colin, overruled him. "I'll allow it. Proceed, Mr. Lawson." What followed was devastating. Marcus Webb testified about Margaret's financial crimes dating back decades. Bank records showed patterns of fraud that matched exactly with Colin's later crimes. Margaret had been the template. Then came the most damning evidence. "Your Honor," Gabriel said, "I'd like to submit into evidence a recording made by Margaret Condon herself." Margaret went white. "What recording?" "The one you made in 1987, planning your first husband's death," Gabriel said calmly. You kept it as insurance against your co-conspirator. You never imagined it would surface now. The courtroom erupted as Gabriel played the recording, Margaret's younger voice, cold and calculating, discussing how to slowly poison her husband while maintaining plausible deniability, how to train Colin to be strong enough to take what he deserves, how women like Ruth, bleeding hearts who think love conquers all, were perfect victims. "That's fabricated," Margaret screamed, shooting to her feet. "That's not me." "Voice analysis confirms it's you," Gabriel said. "Would you like to provide a sample for comparison?" Margaret's lawyers were frantically whispering, trying to control the situation, but it was too late. Judge Morgan had heard enough. "Mrs. Condon," the judge said, her voice like ice, "it appears you're not just an accomplice to your son's crimes, but the architect of them. And now you're attempting to use the same tactics against Ms. Farrell that you've been perfecting for decades." "Your Honor," Margaret's lawyer attempted, "this recording is inadmissible." "On the contrary," Judge Morgan said, "it speaks directly to the claims being made about Ms. Farrell's supposed manipulation. It appears the only manipulator in the Condon family is sitting right there." But Ruth wasn't done. She stood, asking permission to address the court. "Your Honor, Margaret Condon took something from me that can never be returned. 20 years of my life, my chance at motherhood, my ability to trust. But she also gave me something inadvertently. She showed me exactly what I don't want to become." She turned to face Margaret directly. "You had everything, wealth, status, a son who could have been good if you'd let him. But you poisoned it all with your hatred, your racism, your need to control. You created Colin in your own image, and now you both get to live with the consequences." "You destroyed my son!" Margaret shrieked, all pretense of dignity gone. "You turned him against me." "No," Ruth said quietly. "You destroyed him yourself. I just survived long enough to bear witness." The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Margaret's claims were dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, based on the evidence presented, she ordered an immediate investigation into the death of Margaret's first husband and additional charges to be filed. As the bailiffs moved to revoke Margaret's bail, she made one last, desperate play. "I'll give you everything," she shouted at Ruth. "All the hidden accounts, the offshore holdings Colin doesn't even know about. Hundreds of millions. Just drop this, please." Ruth looked at her former mother-in-law, this woman who had tormented her for 2 decades, and felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just emptiness where Margaret's poison used to live. "I don't want your money," Ruth said. "I want you to spend every remaining day of your life in a cell, thinking about what you've done. That's worth more than any amount you could offer." Margaret was dragged away, screaming threats and profanities that echoed through the courthouse halls. Her lawyers scattered like roaches in light, distancing themselves from their toxic client. Outside the courthouse, Ruth stood between Gabriel and Kerry, James in Kerry's arms. The media was there, but Ruth had no statement this time. She was done performing for audiences, done explaining herself. "It's really over," Kerry said wonderingly. "The legal part is," Ruth agreed. "The rest, the healing, the building something new, that's just beginning." Gabriel's hand found hers, and she squeezed it, drawing strength from his steady presence. They walked away from the courthouse together, leaving Colin and Margaret's poisonous legacy behind. That evening, back at the brownstone, Ruth found herself in the nursery she'd set up for James when Kerry visited. She'd painted it soft green, gender-neutral, the color of new growth. All those years, she'd dreamed of decorating a nursery in the mansion, but Colin had always found reasons to delay, to wait. Gabriel found her there, holding a stuffed rabbit she'd bought for the baby she'd lost at 16 weeks. "I'm selling my grandmother's trust fund," she said without preamble. "What? Ruth, that's your security. I'm using it to set up a foundation for women trying to leave abusive marriages but who don't have the resources. Women who are being gaslit, manipulated, controlled. She turned to him. I had money, education, connections, and it was still almost impossible to escape. What about women who don't have those advantages? Gabriel studied her face. That's a beautiful idea. Kerry wants to run it, Ruth continued. She's been taking business classes online. She's brilliant, actually. Colin just never let her show it. And you trust her with this? I trust her because she knows what it's like to be trapped. She'll recognize the women who need help because she was one of them. Ruth set down the rabbit carefully. We were both victims of the Condon family. Now we can be something else. What? Survivors who help other women survive. Gabriel pulled her into his arms, and Ruth let herself lean into his strength. They stood there in the nursery that represented all her lost dreams, planning a future that Colin and Margaret had tried to steal. I love you, Gabriel said quietly, the first time either of them had said it aloud. Ruth pulled back to look at him. Even after seeing all of this, the mess, the drama, the dysfunction, especially after seeing all of it, you faced down monsters and came out with your humanity intact. How could I not love you? Before Ruth could respond, her phone rang. It was the federal prosecutor. Ms. Farrell, I thought you should know immediately. Colin Condon was found dead in his cell an hour ago. The world seemed to stop. What? How? Suicide. He left a note. It's addressed to you. Ruth sank onto the window seat, Gabriel's arms around her. What does it say? It says, you won. I hope you're happy. You've destroyed everything that mattered. Ruth felt something break inside her chest, not her heart, but the last chain that had connected her to Colin Condon. Even in death, he was trying to make her responsible for his choices, trying to burden her with guilt. Ms. Farrell, are you there? Yes, Ruth said, her voice steady. Thank you for telling me. She hung up and looked at Gabriel. He's gone. How do you feel? Ruth considered the question. Free. Finally, completely free. Kerry appeared in the doorway, having heard the phone ring. Ruth told her quickly, watching her process the news that her son's father was dead. James will never know him, Kerry said quietly. No, Ruth agreed, but he'll know us. He'll know love without conditions, support without manipulation, family without poison. The three of them stood in the nursery, the wronged wife, the other woman, and the man who'd helped them both find justice. It should have been awkward, impossible even. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something none of them had imagined, but all of them needed. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the city in clean white that made everything look new. Margaret would spend her remaining years in prison. Colin was gone. The empire built on lies had crumbled, but in a brownstone in Brooklyn, 3 broken people were building something real from the ruins.